Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics, from the American Civil War to the Korean War. On September 11, 1940, the SS Quanza arrived in Norfolk, Virginia. She was carrying a number of Jewish refugees who were fleeing the Nazi war machine. They would find safety through the efforts of the Jewish community in Hampton Roads. Sadly, though, this small humanitarian victory would be the catalyst for the virtual elimination of similar opportunities for future refugees. To tell us more about the Quanza, we are joined today by Wendy Juren, a member of the Holocaust Commission of the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Amanda. It is great to be here.
So to start us off, can you provide an overview of the situation in Europe in 1940, and what are the refugees fleeing?
Well, by the summer, early fall of 1940, the situation in Europe was pretty dire for European Jews. By that time, the war had started in 1939, in September of 1939, and as the Nazis/German army moved west, and they did it very quickly. People were sort of gobstopped at the speed of how quickly they took everything over, because nobody had thought that they possibly would have the nerve to even do that. And so by the time we get to when the Quanza was about to leave, everything had pretty much tightened up. To backtrack a little bit, in 1938, in November of 1938, Kristallnacht had happened. That was the night of the broken glass, where it was essentially state-sponsored violence. And hundreds of Jewish businesses and synagogues were burned and destroyed. Many Jews were murdered and arrested. And this was there was outrage throughout the world, but no one really did anything. And it was one of the most heavily covered events in World War II all over the world. In fact, the Nazis did not want this to be headline news. However, after this, no one really responded in a meaningful way in terms of offering a place for Jews to come. And after that, it became even harder for Jews to leave. Prior to that, it was very difficult. For many countries, they did not want these refugees. Visa restrictions were very, very tight. And in the United States, the amount of paperwork necessary to come here was unbelievable. I mean, it is a really long list of things. And that paperwork you had to have affidavits, you had to have, promises that someone would take care of you, you wouldn't be a burden to the state, and all of those sorts of things. And you have to remember that paperwork had to go back and forth from Europe to the United States over the Atlantic, when your paperwork would be on a ship that would be sunk. So just to have the paperwork to get the visa was extraordinary. And by 1940, you had to have had a lot of resources and means to get to that point, and then to get to Portugal to catch a ship. So these people in 1940, this was it, and they knew it was closing in. And if you were in an occupied part of Nazi Germany or anywhere the Nazis were occupying, in order to get out, you had to pay quite a bit of money. They pretty much extorted you, and then you had to pay a lot of money for passage and all of these things. So just to get to the point where you could get on a ship to even leave was extraordinary. And most of the people on this ship, I think, had quite a bit of means. This was just not an avenue that was open to many people by this time, especially. So this was like a life or death situation. Getting on that ship was really important. And also, I just want to make a note about, other than most of Europe, as I said, was occupied, except for Spain and Portugal. And Spain and Portugal were technically or officially neutral. However, they were playing kind of both sides of the war, because they wanted to keep their economies going. They wanted to keep shipping going. And so just because you got to Spain or Portugal did not mean it was a safe haven. And to get to Portugal, you had to go through Spain, and you had to have the right paperwork to do that. There were visas that were only traveling visas, and you'd have to have a destination on that. And if you didn't have the right paperwork, you could be sent back. So there were all these obstacles before someone even got on the ship. So that's kind of that was the environment that when people boarded the ship in the Quanza in 1940, they were hoping this was they were not coming back. or if they were, it would be after the war. But they were essentially trying to save their lives.
So tell us about the Kwanzaa. How does she become a refugee ship for these particular people?
So the Quanza was originally a ship that was built to, I think it did some trade routes in the Azores, but it also carried passengers. It was kind of a medium-sized ship. At capacity, it could accommodate about 500 passengers, and there were different levels of, first class, second class, and there was a steerage as well. Usually the crew it could top off at 160. They had all kinds of services on the ship, nice food, depending on what class you were in. So it was not, a rowboat. I mean, it wasn't the Queen Mary, but it was a comfortable ship. And the way it kind of became a refugee ship is that, as I was talking about before, people were trying to get out. There were a lot of relief agencies trying to aid Jewish refugees. Some of them were the Joint American Distribution Committee, often called the Joint. Also, organizations like the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which is called HIAS, which is actually, both of these organizations actually are still serving refugees, not just Jewish ones, all over the world. We're looking for ships that they could secure for refugees, and to make sure they were going to go in the right places. But the refugees also would still have to pay, their passage. In the case of the Kwanzaa, of course, the refugees didn't think that they were going to come. They did not want to come back. They would die. The Kwanzaa, just to make sure that they were paid no matter what, made all of the people who booked a passage also put down money for the return passage, and which was a whole nother, it upped the ante even more. So they thought, okay, we don't want to be caught holding the bag in case these people are refused entry and we have to bring them back. So there was that. So at every step there were huge barriers, and no one was really doing anything out of the goodness of their heart.
Quite a lot of challenges.
Yes.
So the Kwanzaa leaves Lisbon on August 9th, 1940, right during hurricane season. How many refugees are on board, and what was the voyage like?
Well, there were 336 refugees on board. So as I said before, it had a capacity of 500, so it was not completely full, although there were refugees who thought it was a little bit of a tight fit. And so they're on board, and within a couple of days, as you said, it was hurricane season, they hit a hurricane. So they start passing out life jackets and telling everybody to get into their cabins. And of course, I can't even imagine, it must have been absolutely frightening. They're thinking, here we have made it onto this ship. We're trying to get out of Europe, and we may die by drowning. I mean, it must have been awful. However, they managed to get through the hurricane, but it still wasn't, complete smooth sailing, so to speak, because, again, it's 1940 and the Battle of the Atlantic is still going on. And they had a high likelihood of being torpedoed by U-boats. Between September of 1939 and July of 1940, 500 ships were sunk. So it was really quite dangerous to cross the Atlantic. So again, yet another thing to worry about. In fact, in addition to many of the Jewish refugees, there were also people who there were 6 sailors from a Dutch oil tanker who had actually been torpedoed on their vessel in July and were on the Quanza, I think, trying to get somewhere safe. It was very dangerous. But I just wanted to mention also, this is really interesting because it wasn't just a ship of Jews, it was also these sailors. There were some very prominent civic leaders, artists, and intellectuals who were trying to get out. And there were 6 men who had been drivers for the American Volunteer Ambulance Corps, who had served in the French Army, who had been captured by the Germans and then released after 3 weeks in that previous July. And there were also 2 women who had been drivers for Friends of France. So it was a real mix of people. In fact, there were 2 people who they were actors, and I don't recall their names right away, but they were in Casablanca. So it was quite a collection of people, but it was very dangerous.
The Kwanzaa arrives in New York on August 20th. Then what happens?
So the Kwanzaa arrives in New York, and 221 people were able to disembark, but 35 people were detained for allegations of irregular paperwork. And out of the 35 of these, 32 were Jewish, or they were related to someone Jewish or a child of someone Jewish. Because in the case of some of these passengers, a husband or someone, a member of the family or friend, was already in the United States and was waiting for them. And they go over all of this paperwork. And a lot of this was because there was, at the time, again, remember that the United States was not in World War II yet. There was still a lot of isolationist feeling. People were still remembering World War One. There was a lot of anti-Semitism. They did not want Jewish refugees coming in. So as policy, I don't think it was really official, but there was a general feeling where if someone came in who was a Jewish refugee, it's possible that they might be a spy, unbelievably. And so they took a closer look than they needed to, because in most cases, the paperwork was fine. There were some other passengers who were detained. Two of them, I'm not sure what the backstory was, were put back on the Quanza to be deported, and 6 were granted temporary visas, not, more permanent ones. And out of those, 2 of these were the deportees, and 4 of them had visas that instead of getting off at New York, they were going to be able to get off in Mexico, which was the next stop for the ship. So now, just to kind of get back to our count, there are now 143 passengers out of the original 336. But there was trouble at that entry point, which was kind of a red flag to kind of keep in mind for the next couple of stops that the ship will make.
So you mentioned Mexico. The Quanza leaves for Veracruz, Mexico on August 23rd. She arrives on August 30th. So then what happens in Mexico?
So once again, in Mexico, everyone's getting ready to get off. A lot of these people have what they feel like are valid visas to disembark in Mexico, and everything seems to be going well, when all of a sudden, after about, I believe it was 43 people, the officials just stop and say, we can't take any more, with no real explanation. And what had happened was that then they start looking at everybody else's and saying, visas, saying, I think these are fraudulent, and making a lot of the same, arguments that were made in New York. We can't let you in. And really what the backstory behind this is that the Mexican government had gotten wind of the ship coming, and there was, again, some anti-Semitic feeling in Mexico, but this was actually an internal struggle, the result of an internal struggle between the Mexican Foreign Affairs Ministry and the Mexican Interior Ministry, which had issued the visas. And so this was kind of a power play, and these poor people got in the middle of it. And so the Foreign Affairs Ministry said, I'm sorry, you shouldn't have issued those visas, and we're not letting these people in. And it was at this point that a lot of the refugees realized that they may not ever get off of this ship, that, after these 2 incidences where they stopped and nothing was really going as planned for many of the people, that they needed to start getting in touch with people. So at this point, they started to wire people, their friends and family, Jewish aid organizations, refugee organizations. They also contacted the Mexican Jewish community to see if they could help. And there were even telegrams and sent to the White House and to Eleanor Roosevelt. So they started to really pull out all the stops and let people know that if they were able to stop again, they were going to really need some help. And so they were in Veracruz, Mexico for a while, and then they had to depart. And they even tried to reroute the ship to convince the captain to go to Nicaragua. Some of the people were destined to, they had planned to go down there in Uruguay, and they said, could you just detour and go down there and drop us off? And he said, no, I'm going back. We're now going to just head back to Portugal.
So on September 5th, the captain begins that return to Lisbon with a planned stop in Norfolk, Virginia, which takes place on September 11th, 1940. Now, this stop is just for supply, not for the passengers to disembark. Can you walk us through the response then of the local Jewish community?
Absolutely. The ship was only, as you said, only there to resupply, and they were only really supposed to be there for 6 hours. And consequently, because it was only resupply, there were no customs people. There was no expectation that anybody would get off. But the refugees, as I mentioned before, had started contacting people to let them know that there was a problem and that they were headed back to Portugal. By the time they were in Norfolk resupplying, people had started to come down to Norfolk to see what they could do. And as I said, they had sent telegrams to the State Department, to Eleanor Roosevelt, who was very active with refugee issues. And a lot of people felt like she had the ear of her husband and could at least, get a little closer in than some people could. Relatives, Jewish aid organizations, and they had started to gather in Norfolk. So one of the people that was on the dock essentially was a woman named Cecilia Rozovsky, and she was a very active member of the National Refugee Service, which was part of a committee through the government, and also the National Council of Jewish Women, which was a women's organization volunteer. And Cecilia was not going to take anything, silently. So she was contacting people, but she also contacted the local organization or the local branch of the National Council of Jewish Women, and she activated them, and they were there as well. And these were women who are real get-it-done people. Two of the people, one of them was Elise Margolis and Justine Nussbaum. And these are two women who, of course, have now passed away, but not only with this incident with the Quanza, but with many, many other refugees. They were very instrumental in helping them get settled if they could escape, but also post-war were very active in helping people to reestablish their lives here. So these women were like an army, and they started to get in touch with everybody. They started gathering supplies. The government would not let anybody onto the ship. And I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I'm getting ahead of myself with the story. So one of the other members of the Jewish community, J.L. Morowitz, who was a maritime lawyer, had been contacted by a friend of someone on the ship to see what he could do. And J.L. Morowitz because he was a maritime lawyer, he really understood all of the law that involved ships and how long they could be there and who was on them and, what was legal and what was not. And so he actually filed a libel suit against the shipping company that said that they had, for $100,000, and it said that that the shipping company had broken their contract with the Rand family, and they were passengers on the ship, and that that there needed to be a hearing, and the ship could not leave until this hearing had happened. So that was a delay tactic so that hopefully more people from the State Department could come down and do an investigation. So he files this action, and of course they have to wait a couple of days before the judge can hear them, as well as it included a bond of $5,000 that the shipping company had to raise before they could even leave, in addition to the hearing. Bought some time. And in the meantime, there were officials who came down from the president's refugee committee. He had a special committee that kind of oversaw these visas and this emergency situation that had evolved as the war had started. And so between all of these things, these officials came down and were able to get on the ship and interview the refugees and determine whether they were a danger to the United States or they were spies or whatever. I mean, there were a lot of children on the ship and just regular citizens, clearly people who were not any threat at all. So within a couple of days, they came down and were able to determine that most of the people, in fact, all of them, were not a threat and that they could disembark. The Jewish community, I kind of jumping around here, while they were waiting for this to all happen, they brought food and were able to get it onto the ship. But there was the Coast Guard was guarding the ship. They had security detail. They would not let these people leave at all because they were afraid they were flight risks. But they were able to get supplies onto the ship, but they were ready for whatever came next. They'd sort of mobilized everyone, and they were also doing whatever they could while they were waiting for the State Department to come, these officials to come down and determine the status of the people on the ship. So what did happen is that they determined that all of these people could disembark, and they were able to leave. And the Jewish community, working with relief agencies, had chartered a bus for anybody who wanted to go back up to New York. And many people were also able to get off the train soon enough to catch a train. But there were a handful of people who didn't have anywhere to go. They couldn't leave town automatically. Nobody really had plans, of course, to stay in this area because they never thought they would be there. They all thought that it would either be in New York or Mexico. So in the middle of the night, Elise Margolis and Justine Nussbaum called everybody they knew. They gathered up supplies, all of their vehicles, and they loaded people in and took them home and hosted them at their homes for an evening and gave them some Southern hospitality. And it was just, it's a wonderful story. And there were 81 people who got off in Norfolk. So, it was a happy ending. There were children, there were toddlers, worried mothers. And so it was really, really a wonderful, happy reunion that happened in Norfolk, and a really happy ending, which was not the case in a lot of these stories, with a lot of these refugee stories.
Now, in the introduction, I mentioned that the Quanza was a humanitarian victory. And it's such an incredible example of the community here in Norfolk kind of coming together to play a part in that. But this victory also triggered eventually a reduction in immigration to the United States. Can you explain this?
Yes. Unfortunately, the happy ending really led to an incredible tightening of immigration and refugee policy for the United States, not our finest hour. Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long, who'd been kind of overseeing this, and he was not a fan of, he was very anti-immigrant, as was Congress at the time. And he had been doing everything he could to block more refugees coming in. And I'd like to point out that there were quite a few visas available, but Undersecretary Long and others in the State Department who were working with the president's emergency visa program, which was ministered through a special committee that he had appointed. And those are the people that came down to interview the passengers. He pretty much, within the day of all of those passengers getting off of the Quanza, terminated it. And all of the advisory committee refugee members resigned in protest. And it tightened up. It actually made it almost virtually impossible to get into the United States and then what Long did was he also made sure that all of the European consuls delayed any requests and slowed it up. And he'd been doing this prior to the Quanza incident. So it pretty much stopped the flow of any sort of chance for people to come to this country. So those last few people who got off the Quanza were really incredibly lucky. And consequently, when things like this would happen, it was always a signal to the Nazis that no one really wanted the Jews. And it was another signal that they could continue to do whatever they wanted. And so if Jews could not, they'd really encouraged Jews, if they could, to emigrate. But now they realized if they were going to eliminate Jews, they were probably going to have to murder them. Now, this was more than 2 years before the final solution was formulated. But this was a signal to them that no other countries are going to take them, so we need to take care of this themselves. So it really was a really unfortunate consequence when they tightened all the immigration law.
On May 9th, 2024, the MacArthur Memorial and the Holocaust Commission of the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater are going to be partnering to screen Nobody Wants Us, a documentary film about the Quanza, directed and produced by Laura Seltzer Dunny, a relative of J.L. Morowitz, the lawyer that was so instrumental in helping to delay the Quanza's departure from Norfolk. Information about that event is in the episode description and on the MacArthur Memorial's website, www.macarthurmemorial.org. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Holocaust Commission, though, and the work you do? Because I know there's a podcast series and a book.
Thank you so much for asking. So the Holocaust Commission is part of the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater. We've been around for about 40 years, and our main goal is to provide educational resources. So the book that you are referring to is called To Life, the Past is Present, and it's a collection of stories that have a local connection. All of the people in it, it's survivors, liberators, and rescuers. And all of the people that are featured in the book at one time, either they made their home somewhere in Hampton Roads, or they were from here. Some of the liberators actually grew up here. The Quanza story is actually in that book. And it's not it's one of those stories that not a lot of people know about, even now. Because of the film, it's gotten a little bit more attention. The film is really wonderful because we were talking about a lot of the facts and more historical details. But what the film does is it gives all of these people on the ship a voice. And she was able to talk to some of the survivors before they passed away and also access some of the diaries and letters of the others. And it really kind of brings the story to life in a much more personal way. It's one of the best, I think, windows to open up when you're trying to, learn about history is to hear the real voices. And so that it does a really good job of that. It's a nice addition to the story. We also have the podcast series that you refer to is called Stars Among Us. And we have an upcoming 2-episode podcast about the Quanza, which is not out yet. But we feel like this story is really, really important because it happened here and it was so, pivotal in determining how U.S. immigration policy unfolded during World War II. We have the book, we have the podcast, we also have a program we offer to schools and community groups called What We Carry, which is also several stories of different survivors and liberators and rescuers, along with suitcases full of items that are emblematic of the different stories that we tell, that we take out. So we have all kinds of different things that we offer that are all at no charge. Because we feel like this is a really important topic that people should be able to dig into. And we're very proud of what we've had. We're a recognized source of Holocaust education by the State Department of Education in Virginia, too. We work closely with them. So we're really, really thrilled to be partnering with the MacArthur Memorial because you two are very dedicated to getting the history out there. And so this is very exciting, and we hope that people will come and sample the film and ask questions.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and for telling the story of the Quanza.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure. And I want to encourage everyone, if they are free on May 9th, to come out to the MacArthur Memorial and see the film.
Yes, and I will second that. Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.